Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's BidVantage webinar, which is, as you hopefully well know, is Will Renewable Energy Fuel the Future? Good afternoon, Rob.
Good day, evening. It is.
It's evening with you, isn't it?
7 o'clock, yeah.
7 o'clock, excellent. Okay, right, let's get straight into today then. So as people who join us regularly will know, myself and Rob, for those people that are new or are watching this for the first time, we've been around for a while in the bidding world. We also do various bits around general consultancy. For those people that are interested, our backgrounds are there. We won't major on those too much, but essentially we've both had careers in healthcare and now in consultancy, with a number of those years being focused on business development. So the session today, we are going to look at a number of different areas. The first of those is the current situation. We'll then look at energy policy in general. There'll be a bit of focus on Great British Energy. Then we'll look at implications for bidders. And then we will summarise the session, which should finish bang on 1 o'clock, hopefully, as long as we don't get too carried away. So first of all, let's start with the current situation. And at this point, Rob, I will hand over to you, and I will try and take a back seat this time.
Well, just a slight bit of a curveball, just before we get in. As I say, over here, I was trying to think about what renewables do I actually use on a day-to-day basis, which is quite interesting to think of. We bought a house and it's got solar panels on the roof. Many places have solar panels on the roof over here, and the energy goes straight into the grid and takes money off of our electricity bills. Australia is a big place, so electric vehicles are a nightmare. If you're not in one, if you live and work in one of the main cities, electric vehicles work. Doing long drives in the outback, the infrastructure won't exist. But we do see a lot of hybrids, particularly as Toyotas are everywhere. I would say almost 50% of the cars over here are Toyotas, and a lot of them are hybrids. I just wondered, on the other side of the coin, Matt, is there anything in your home, with your motoring, with anything, where it's renewable or where that's planned? I'm thinking of getting a hybrid in the future, for example.
Yeah, definitely not motoring. No, my car's the opposite end of an electric car. In terms of everything else, in fact, what I have noticed recently is I live in a sort of fairly rural part of the country. A lot of farmland around us, and there are a significant number of farms now putting up solar in the fields, on a fairly large scale as well. There's always been the odd wind turbine here and there, and you'll see the kind of big ones on the high ground, but now individual farms have got smaller turbines, but solar's been the most noticeable development.
Interesting.
Yeah. One of the things, actually, Rob, that just takes me back to a project I was hoping to get off the ground. So I live in an old mill, and there's a river that runs through the building. And one of the things that we had looked at years ago was whether we could generate enough electricity from the river.
Yeah.
And for a whole number of reasons, mostly time, that has kind of taken a back seat. But I think that would be a great.
Was it cost as well?
Well, I don't think we ever got to a point where we got accurate costs on it.
Okay.
But it's the river's an incredible source of power.
Well, that's where I was going with it, because we'll find some of this later, but sometimes the arguments against renewable energy projects is the upfront capital investment to make it happen, because the benefits generally happen over a longer term, and a lot of people aren't interested in that. So that won't go. I'm trying to avoid politics when we go through this. It's going to be difficult, but that's often why a lot of these schemes haven't happened, is because the upfront investment, and maybe the technology hasn't always been there, that people are looking for short-term gain. And that's a slight problem, for example, with governments who have an election cycle and need to think about what can work for them within that time to hopefully for them to get re-elected, which is a slight failing of our system, but that's another wider point entirely. That one of the things that sprung to mind was tidal power, which has often been talked about. But the cost to do that is immense, even though the electricity generation, particularly for places like the Severn Estuary, which is one of the biggest tidal systems in the world, the energy would be amazing. The other opposition to that often comes from anglers, such as yourself.
Yes.
Not specifically you, but often they'll talk about disruption to the ecosystems, which there would be. And there is a balance with a lot of what we'll talk about today, where it's there's potentially a very good green impact for renewable energy versus maybe issues around biodiversity or it's not. I was going to call it site pollution, but the argument's often against wind farms. Some people can't see them.
As you've been talking, I've remembered one of the reasons why I didn't get any further, which was because there was a scheme around trying to improve the environment for the trout that live in the river, and turbines and fish don't necessarily always water. So
No, they don't.
It's that well. So I think it'd be a great example of how to have a sort of self-sustaining building, but it is quite complex, even on this small scale, where there's a small river and a building, and
that is the kind of scheme that I believe, and again we'll get to this later, is Great British Energy. One of their things is around small community projects helping generate electricity. So I wonder if you might have a grant opportunity there in the future, if that's something you want to go down. And again, I am going off a little bit, but this is all relevant. It just made me think about somewhere else that we both know, which is Pitlochry. The salmon ladder there, which is something that they have built to get round all the infrastructure they've built around renewable energy, is actually build that salmon ladder to allow the salmon to get through. So there are ways around it, but maybe not through an old mill in Nottinghamshire.
Well, that project that kind of complicated things was actually a fish pass that the Environment Agency were looking at. Anyway, I won't bore you with all the details.
No, but it's nice to bring it back to relevance rather than us just talking about policy, which is interesting unto itself. So I think, I graduated from university in 2008, and pretty much since then, November 2008, the UK passed the Climate Change Act, which I think for me was kind of the big first bit of legislation that went the UK's looking towards green. Now, a lot of this was influenced by various climate conferences and things going on around the world. You may have heard about the Kyoto Protocol. We won't delve into that kind of stuff and go too far back on that. But November 2008 is where it really kind of kicks off. That act committed the UK to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 compared to 1990 levels, which was quite an interesting way of looking at it. I think there's two elements to that. One, emissions would have been very high in 1990 for various reasons, but that also meant 18 years had passed, and however they were calculating it meant probably quite a few of those emissions had already been reduced. But anyway, they also established a committee on climate change to establish UK carbon budgets. The next big bit of legislation, which we should all be familiar with in the bidding and procurement world, is 2019, where the net zero target was set for 2050. So rather than just having those greenhouse gas emissions cut by 80%, it's actually to be net zero. And Matt, please correct me on this. I don't want to get my definition overly wrong on this, but it's probably just some people get the carbon neutrality mixed up with net zero. So if you've heard of those terms, carbon neutrality is essentially you can offset your emissions to get to zero emissions. So you could buy carbon credits or plant trees or things like that. Whereas net zero is actually you have net zero emissions through what you do as a business. This isn't what this webinar will be about, so we won't go through the various scopes. In fact, Matt, we did a webinar, I'm going to say that's 6-7 months ago, with Net Zero International, where that was explained quite nicely if people are interested. I'm quite surprised at this next bit, is that the UK was the first country to set legally binding carbon budgets. I am relatively surprised about that. I think since then, many countries have overtaken us in how green they've got, but that's lots of factors that have occurred since these were put in place. You know, we've had Brexit, we've had all sorts of political issues, and Ukraine and all sorts. So we'll move on to the next slide.
I think just if people want to know the source of this information and how legitimate it is, a lot of this, particularly that point there, Rob, that you picked up, is from an official document from the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero.
Yeah.
The document is called Net Zero Government Initiative, the UK Roadmap to Net Zero Government Emissions. So assuming you believe that an official document like that has got a reasonably accurate source of information, then that's where the source information's from. And it is a very...
pretty much everything we talk about today is from official government documentation, just to make that clear. It's not just us thinking about things.
That was actually a very simple document to read and understand, so I might just drop that in the comments or a link to it later.
Okay, on to the next one. So there has been a lot of investment. So the main figures I've found have been since 2010, when the coalition came in. And Matt, I think I mentioned to you yesterday, one of my first memories of David Cameron was, I don't know where he was, but he was on a trip. It might be in Canada or the Arctic. And I think he hugged a husky, or he was pictured with huskies. And the whole point was, you know, the Conservatives are green focused. And actually, I think the coalition government 2010 to 2015 showed that and actually started to make a lot of the work happen towards getting towards the targets that the UK had to hit. So between 2010 and 2015, despite austerity that was going on, £40 billion worth was invested mostly in offshore wind projects. And you might have seen some of these mentioned in the next time frame as well. Hornsea, Dogger Bank. If you ever fly off the east coast of the UK and it's actually a clear sunny day, you're likely to see some very large offshore wind projects. And so in 2016 to 20, we had a similar investment, and that was maintained again, even in the last years of the Conservative government. Again, the big focus was offshore wind. Now, I've got some theories behind why that's happened, why it's offshore. One, there's plenty of space. Two, the North Sea is, as we all know, very windy in particular. And three, they're not on hills annoying people with visual pollution, I'm going to say it. So there's less issues or less objection from local groups. I believe the main thing depends on who owns the seabed, which is the Crown Estate, which again we'll get to talking about later. A lot of these offshore wind farms, or some of the bigger ones, are owned by, I'm going to say, other countries' energy firms. So the Norwegian energy firm, I think the French one, often own these firms. I think there's probably quite an interesting point when we get to Great British Energy later is there a focus about trying to encourage UK companies to do this work rather than bringing in expertise from other countries? So that's quite interesting. So in 2010, only 7% of the UK's energy production was from renewable, what I'll call renewable clean sources, because nuclear, which we'll get to down the slide, is a little bit different there. In 2015, that had increased massively to 24%. And bear in mind, the UK's energy demand is also growing during this time as well. At the moment, around 40% of the UK's electricity is generated from renewable energy sources. And I believe there have been times in the last few years, particular days and weeks, where the renewable energy sources have powered the entire grid. And I think the coal plants are only brought online as required to make up, well, in some cases, it's a huge shortfall versus the renewable, but sometimes they're not even required. 25% of all of the electricity generation is from wind, unsurprisingly, considering all the investment that's gone into it. And I was quite surprised about the solar element, considering our or I'm going to say your sometimes lack of sunlight, although solar does still bring it in when it's cloudy. But I wonder if it works particularly well in the summer with the very long days. And Matt, you were mentioning about the farmers in places. And I think there's some near my parents actually in the Cotswolds. I believe there were subsidies back in the day. I know through the EU there were subsidies to have renewable energy on land you're not using, and I think the UK government has continued that. Biomass is one that's been quite interesting. I've always read interesting things about that, but it's interesting to see that's a reasonable percentage as well. I don't have the figures for Scotland, but I know in Scotland a lot of their power generation is hydro. And that's from a building program in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where they built a lot of hydropower. And I actually went on a trip. I think it's Loch Awe, which is near the west coast, and you can go under the mountain to see the hydro power station working underneath. So excellent day trip for a family. Not sponsored by them. But that is quite interesting. Nuclear, which this is interesting. Nuclear is sometimes counted as renewable and sometimes not. This is why sometimes you hear the phrase clean renewable, which takes away nuclear. So nuclear accounts for 15 to 17% of the UK's electricity generation. There are a few projects going on to increase this. If you live in Somerset, you may know about Hinkley Point C, which is due to come online 2029, 2031. And that is huge. The nuclear generation from that, nuclear electricity generation from that will increase quite a bit. But Hinkley Point C, because I'm a member of the Somerset Chamber of Commerce, and a lot of what they do comes back to the Hinkley Point C supply chain. Because it's so big and what's going on there, there's a lot of money. Even when I worked in Somerset about 8 years ago, there were diversions and all sorts going on to get everything through to Hinkley Point C, because there's some massive equipment that goes through there and a lot of labour as well. It's quite interesting.
Okay. Was there anything else on the current state of play, Rob, or should we?
No, unless you've got an opinion on nuclear or anything, whilst I have a sip of water.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting one because there's clearly all the sort of safety concerns around it. I think if you're old enough and remember things like Sellafield and some of the other things that have happened, it's I imagine there's a lot of public trepidation about what's going on with nuclear. It's a very efficient form of energy production, but I think it will always have that.
It's dealing with the waste afterwards as well.
Yeah.
And there was an article about it the other day. Is what are we going to do with our where are we going to put it? What are we going to do with it? And I think there were even talk. We're talking a few years back now. Where, will another country take it off our hands? It's a bit.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that one is a really interesting one to watch and see how it develops, particularly over the longer term.
And the other thing I was going to say is that just a few comparisons. So the UK is in the top 10 for the percentage of electricity it generates through renewable energy. At the top of the list is Norway, which I've seen various figures, 95, 98%. If you haven't been to Norway, you can understand how they've done that. But I believe they also invested a lot of money from the North Sea oil into them building all that infrastructure for the future. In Australia, we're actually higher than I expected. I believe we're around 38% of that. The government, again, not trying to be too political, but the government over here struggles with renewable energy. In fact, I think we're building a new coal power power station over here. But anyway, it's another matter entirely. But there's always been a lot of talk of, should Australia build these massive solar farms in the desert in the Nullarbor, which could generate a lot of electricity. On the other side of the coin, the infrastructure of actually getting that done is another matter entirely. But I believe New South Wales, a lot of its electricity is generated by a hydro power plant in the Snowy Mountains, which is quite famous. But anyway, the UK does very well, quite interestingly.
I think this is a really interesting, just when you sort of think about the global context of what impact the UK actually has globally, and it's negligible. But as we'll come on to throughout the webinar, for people that bid, you are almost forced into taking this approach because of the way procurements have developed. So whether or not you agree with the UK having any sort of significant impact globally, we are pretty much forced down this route. So I think,
like with any social value, the rules are there, the policy's there. If you want to participate, you have to play.
Yeah. Well, that sort of links us nicely into policy, Rob. So I will let you try
not to get too political, but every time I see Ed Miliband's face, I think of the bacon sandwich, and that's such an unfortunate thing because I quite like what he says generally. And it's interesting that he is the champion and has been championing this even when Labour are in opposition to make a real push to this. We're not going to go. We don't have time to go into anywhere near the detail on this that this deserves. The link is there to make Britain a clean energy superpower, one of Labour's big plans, which in fairness, it looks like they're trying to back up at the moment. They have a lot of plans, jobs, investment. I think, Matt, you were saying in the East Midlands, it's a bit too small to see here, but they have actually said how many jobs and investment. Was it how many? What was it? $1.5 billion.
Yes.
Battery power fund.
Yeah. So the National Wealth Fund. So there seems to be 4 categories that they refer to for all of these different boxes, which are jobs, National Wealth Fund, warm homes, and local power plan. As you say, Rob, for places like the East Midlands, they have actually put a monetary value on, which was £1.5 billion for the battery power fund. There's also a pledge to spend up to 500 million, and that was fund green hydrogen manufacturing. So there are some interesting bits of detail there, and it's quite nice that it's broken down by the different parts of the country, so people can see what's happening in certain areas, whether that's where you live or whether you bid into. It just gives you a heads up of what potentially might be on the agenda.
Now, although I don't live in the UK, I will do again in the future. And I don't care what political persuasion you are. If they get this right, I think it's very good and very interesting. And I'm quite pleased that one of the big things at the start of their term in government is to try and get this going now with a long-term view to it actually making a difference. Whether it will or not is another matter. Even I'm doubtful that they'll. I mean, nobody ever pulls off everything they put in their manifestos and their plans. But if they get even half of this done and do create jobs and increase renewables, I think there will be a benefit. Now, I'm trying not to be overly cynical, but Labour gets their votes from everywhere in the country. Obviously, not Northern Ireland. That's a bit different. But I think that's interesting to see that they are trying to spread different initiatives all across the country. And there's a big focus on Scotland, which we'll get to later with Great British Energy. But I think that's also good as well. We don't want anything too south-focused. And when I say south, I don't ever include the southwest in that. We always get forgotten about. It's usually London and the southeast. So I'm very pleased to see that. And it's something I think I'm going to try and keep track of over the next 5 years, is to actually see what happens with this and what impact that has on the opportunities we see as well. All these plans around jobs and investment Are we going to see lots of new opportunities for independent companies to bid on, whether that's consultancy or actually infrastructure maintenance, whatever that is? So and obviously that will have a big knock-on effect for supply chains and jobs as well. So if we continue onwards. So we've rather than go back to the manifesto, which manifestos often don't materialise, whatever party you support. We've looked at the King's Speech as well. So the King's Speech, for people that don't know, is essentially the government's plans for the next Parliament. So the Parliament we're in at the moment, at the start of that, the King made a speech, and Labour had given that to him. And the things we picked out are specifically related to renewable energy. The first one is the formation of Great British Energy. We've got a separate section on that later, which is probably the biggest element of this. There's a few other small bits we picked out. One is around sustainable aviation fuels. Aviation emissions account for around 8% of all of the UK's emissions. Getting that down is quite difficult. Green options for flying aren't great at the moment. So the only real way to try and tackle that at the moment is more sustainable aviation fuels and making those fuel mixes slightly more green. This is quite a small step. So if the bill passes, it will mandate that all fuel supplies contain at least 10% of sustainable aviation fuels. What impact that will have, we might be looking at a percentage or two at most in terms of cutting that down. But the other thing to note is that may be balanced by increasing air travel. And if any of the airports get their expansion plans accepted, Heathrow, for example, and the third runway saga that will never end by the sounds of it. The other point that was made, and this is relevant, is the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate owns huge tracts of land and most of the UK seabed. And that's relevant for offshore wind farm development. So through the King's Speech, what was being said is a bill might be passed where the Crown Estate can borrow money from the Treasury, which means it can then invest in renewable energy projects. It can invest in other projects as well, but it's specifically relating to renewable energy projects. There's another element to the Crown Estate down the line as well, where it should speed up approval and planning processes as well. An interesting one is around water company bosses. I'm sure everyone's heard of sewage in the rivers, particularly companies like Thames Water having issues. So this bill, if it goes through, will ban bonuses for executives if environmental standards are not met. Be interesting to see if that bill actually goes through and how that is dealt with. I wonder if there'll be creative ways of getting around that. Another one which does link back to the environment is the Better Buses Bill, which is the idea to make local public transport more accessible. This will give local authorities more powers to create bus routes and even run their own bus companies. That's mainly for local accessibility, but in theory that could reduce car travel, if you've got an easy bus route. There is another bill around high-speed rail as well, but with HS2 being cancelled, I think it's a bit murkier as to what might actually happen there. But that's quite interesting as well. Just whilst I have a bit of water, Matt, any thoughts on any of that? I'm particularly thinking about the fact that you have a river going through your building.
And funnily enough, I was watching a programme with Paul Whitehouse this week about this very issue of polluted rivers and lakes. And it's just an interesting watch. And it's quite eye-opening as well to see what's going on in terms of discharge into rivers and various other things. But the thing that just occurred to me was even though this was way before the Better Buses Bill, we're probably about 45 minutes away from the city centre on the bus. And bus prices a couple of years ago were almost to the point where you'd think, well, I'll just take the car and pay the extortionate parking in the city centre. And I don't know when this happened, but it was maybe in the last year, 18 months. But they've dropped all bus fares to a couple of quid now, like literally £2 into town. So that makes, that argument now. Well, do I take the car and pay 15 quid parking, or do I just hop on the bus for 2 quid each way? And it's a real dilemma now of whether you just jump in the car. So I think I was amazed at how cheap it was nowadays. And they've also put some electric buses into the city centre. They don't quite stretch to the more sort of rural places at the moment.
Oh, yeah,
but I think there's a real drive on public transport at the moment. So I think some of this stuff was already happening, and it looks like it's continuing to happen, and in a positive way as well.
I wonder if I don't want to go too far off piste, but I've always thought about things like buses and water and things like that, and the idea for many years that they can only exist if they make money. So if you're living in a remote village and for any reason you can't drive, and that's not just you haven't learned, there's might be a medical reason. Is it a right that you should have access to transport? Is it something that should actually make money? Obviously, you don't want it to lose loads of money, but it's just an interesting point, and whether things like this have a wider value, almost social value, dare I say. But that also would include an environmental value as well. I used to use buses all the time. I lived in Cotswold villages. We're lucky. We were 10 minutes from Bath in the car. We had one bus a week to Bath.
What?
It's mad, absolutely mad. I'd get into Bristol. There were two buses a day, or Chippenham. But you want to go to Bath? I just didn't go into Bath because it wasn't practical. And lots of older people and younger people, it makes living in villages quite tricky if you don't have that accessibility, and you just end up with your parents being your taxi services. Anyway, slightly off piece, but I just wonder if there's a when, and I don't know if we'll see this in the Better Buses bill, but will there be an environmental value attached to some of the criteria for this, particularly if some of these new bus services do go out to procurement?
It is interesting though, because I was just thinking as you were talking, the roads are fairly well used by cars and buses. You were talking about flying earlier. But rivers are one of the things that aren't often used for transport. I mean, clearly, years ago, they used to move goods around.
Yeah, you've got all these canal systems that were built. By the time they were finished being built, the trains had happened. So
but I mean, actually, for me, and a lot of people that live down the Trent, the river into Nottingham is a really useful way, and I'm surprised that no one's come up with a river taxi yet. I suspect they've been a little bit slower, but more relaxed, and probably not very nice on a cold, wet day.
Well, there's a tourist element to it as well. We have the river over here, the Swan River, is massive in places. There are cruises down it, but there's also transport services. And I know on the Thames there are river taxis as part of TfL.
Yeah,
so it is a possible point.
There we go.
Anyway.
Right. Should we move on to other plans?
So other plans. So these weren't explicitly mentioned in the King's speech, but some of them are already happening. So the big one that I hadn't noticed until we were looking at the research for this webinar was the plan to decarbonize the energy sector by 2030. The idea to have an entirely renewable energy grid. Now, I believe this includes nuclear as part of that. And I think that's the only way it would be possible. So that's quite interesting. And, we're coming towards the end of 2024 already. That's a big 5-year plan. That almost sounds like an election commitment. That there'll be quite a long way to decarbonising it. I think there are a few elements to this. One, if they get more renewable energy projects off the ground through Great British Energy. But there's also things like Hinkley Point C will come online 2029 to 2031, which will increase the overall renewable energy side of things. I do believe some of the big coal power stations will be on the brink of decommissioning as well. Matt, I'm almost certain there's some huge coal power stations around the Nottingham way. I'm sure I've driven around a few. I think there's roads that you seem to always see one of those big plants in the distance, if I remember.
There's plenty visible from the M1.
Yeah, that's
all the
probably
way
what I'm
through
thinking.
as you kind of get north to Sheffield, and
Yeah.
you can see them from the motorway.
Yeah, I don't think they'll be around for too much longer. And I guess some of them are very old as well by this point as well.
Yeah.
But it's still kind of a shock to see, actually, when you go past them. They are massive chimneys, absolutely fat chimneys, putting out all these fossil fuels. So that is quite interesting. So they are established, what is it, mission control, which I don't like the phrase for, establishing that to accelerate delivery of a clean GB power system by 2030. There are bits and pieces around that, as you see the snippet from the letter on the side. I don't want to get his name wrong. Finland Sly, who is to do with the national grid, and he's a big part of this strategy. Won't go into detail on this. If you're interested, do a bit more research, but this is kind of in its infancy as well as to how some of this is going to happen. So it's Finton Sky. You'd written it out, and there's me trying to read the small print. Finland. So the quote there from Finton: "I fully expect that during next year, the electricity system will operate zero carbon for periods of time." Which is very interesting. Now, as I mentioned, it has been entirely renewable at times, but that wouldn't have meant necessarily zero carbon, because I'm sure there's elements of the grid that do emit carbon despite that. I believe I've read elements that the grid needs upgrading or modernizing as well, but I'm not au fait with what the state of the grid is at the moment. If we move on.
I think this is when I first read that statement, I thought, it's good they've got somebody that believes it's possible, because I've seen lots of other opinions that say it's nowhere near possible, but at least they've got a guy there that has faith in delivering the plan. But I think the get out of jail free bit of that is for periods of time.
Yeah, for periods. I think it will be days, and I think I'm going to say, in fairness to them, we don't know what will happen in the world. I mean, no one, you wouldn't have expected Ukraine to happen. That wouldn't have been part of people's planning, and that has had a huge impact on everything, including energy. So,
I mean, the thing with all this stuff is it's moving forwards, isn't it? And it's a monumental shift, and it's not going to happen overnight. So, anyway, there we go. Before we get into too much political debate, right? Should we cover Great British Energy then?
Yeah, Great British Energy is the biggest plank. Let's call it a plank. The biggest plank of Labour's energy policy. They made a big point about this during the election, and they've continued to talk about it. And one of the big things about it was that it will be based in Scotland and established within the first 100 days. I believe we're coming up to the first 100 days. I think we might be in like the 80 or 90 something day. And in fairness, Great British Energy is well on the way to being established. It will be a new and fully publicly owned company focused on generating clean energy. So that's 100% publicly owned. That is relevant to our world, which we'll get on to later. It's going to be headquartered in Aberdeen. If you know Aberdeen, it is essentially known for oil and gas. That's what it's known for. So that's an interesting place to put it, right in the middle of the almost the enemy, I would say, for Great British Energy. And they will have further sites in Glasgow and Edinburgh. There's the idea that it will create jobs in Scotland, even just from the headquarters, let alone any of the projects it does. The idea is that this will be paid for by a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. There's estimates of how much that might raise. I think I saw something like 8 billion or something. I don't want to go into too much detail onto this because this gets very political as to how this happens. I can see how it was a vote winner for some people. So I'll gloss over that, Matt. If you want to put in some editorial at any point, you're more than welcome to. But just to give an idea of what Great British Energy is meant to deliver, and again, these are all official things from Great British Energy, is to cut energy bills for families. I think I saw something around £1,400 is the idea. boost Britain's energy security, is something I actually agree with, particularly after Ukraine. The more self-sustaining the energy generation is, the better. I think. I don't think you can argue with that. It just depends on how it's done. Backing British workers in industrial heartlands. I think we can go back to what Matt was saying around the East Midlands, around some of the commitments there. Also saw there were some big commitments for the West Midlands as well, areas that may have felt rather neglected for decades, not just the past government. Publicly owned with profits, if there are any, I'm going to caveat that with going back to the British people, i.e. into the Treasury. And again, supporting local jobs and supply chains, which I can't argue with that if it does that. So I think on paper, the idea of this is admirable. Matt, you have more, as you're older than me, if you don't mind me saying so, you have more of a memory of what we would call nationalized companies or publicly owned companies, which some people have fond memories of and some people do not. So without getting too political, I'm happy to have some skepticism in this, because I am as well, because the other thing is nothing like this has really been tried.
And it's an interesting one, this, because if you were being really cynical and critical, you might go down the path of saying, well, if it's if it's in the public sector, it's likely to get quite flabby and inefficient and swamped with bureaucracy, in which case then it will probably be thrown back into the private sector to get it a little bit leaner and more efficient. And then things like this seem to go around in circles of, we'll bring it into the public sector, and most of the time it's not the most efficient way of doing things. But what's interesting about this is when you look at those three initial priorities, a lot of this is about public and private sector working
together, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's a really interesting dynamic there, because the two don't always work in terms of operational and management policies, whether that's staff or delivery. I think if you could take the best of both sides, of public sector and private sector, you probably end up with a decent product. It's very difficult to do that in reality. But I think the bits that are really interesting about those priorities are the initial investment in new technologies. And that was one of the things that we were going to cover in this, was the gap from where we are now to where we will go. And I think, some of that stuff is around tidal, but the one thing that's really interesting is hydrogen. And I think that's...
Yeah, it's a huge thing over here as well. Trying to maybe not unlock it is the right phrase, but make it work, because the energy potential is huge. Yeah,
and I think there are a lot of different areas where innovation and technology might happen outside of this. So, thinking about motor car racing, hydrogen engines out there. So I think there's lots of different things. And I know actually I saw an advert for BMW who'd got a hydrogen engine at the moment. It's covered with other manufacturers who've got hydrogen in development. So I think that's going to be very, very interesting to watch. And then, so that's obviously, from where we are now to closing the gap to new and fully clean energy technology, but then also continuing to invest in mature technologies, which is that second point. So expanding what we already have. And then the third point, which you touched on, Rob, was the scale of municipal and community energy. So, maybe that is where I get some time to play with the river and spare the fish. But I think those are three fairly logical and sensible areas to focus on: is invest what we have, look to the future, and then the very localized things that might make a difference to specific communities.
The only advantage they may have, so take a different example very quickly, is the idea to nationalize the rail franchises once those contracts expire. What you're doing with that is taking over an existing situation and still having to deal with it. So it probably will be quite inefficient and flabby still for a while. The only advantage I can see Great British Energy have versus that is this is happening from scratch. So there is the opportunity to get it, but of course they're not going to get everything right. So a big element of that will have been who are the people that are going to be running this? Who's going to be in charge of it? Do they have the right expertise? Is it a nice blend of public and private of people, public and private industry people? Look, one thing I hadn't seen in this, but I kind of assumed it would be happening, is the partnership with academic institutions as well, because I would imagine that would be a big element to looking at not just bringing in technology from elsewhere, but actually developing that, University of Oxford or whatever it might be, in looking at kind of new and experimental technologies. But I think if it were, and again, I will be keeping an eye on this as we go along, because it's very interesting. And it should result in more bidding opportunities, which we'll get onto in a minute.
Speaking of that, I mean, we have started to actually jump onto the next slide.
I think we can probably gloss over this. The only thing we hadn't really mentioned is what we've touched on. This is the supply chain element, which the whole idea is to build local supply chains. Develop that expertise in the UK and develop those jobs in the UK. And I think part of that is, if jobs are being created through renewable energy, I think there is also an element that the environmental side of things could be seen more positively by some people as well. I think that will have a knock-on effect. The other thing which I thought I touched on earlier was GBE will have a partnership with the Crown Estate. I think that's already been developed, which is a big thing to speed up planning and approval and get projects off the ground, sometimes literally a lot quicker. We won't go into too much detail on this, but Great British Nuclear. I couldn't quite get this, Matt. Has this already been established in the past, or is this a new establishment? But either way, it's going to be working with Great British Energy, because, as we've mentioned before, there's that crossover with what renewable means.
Yeah, my understanding was that it is actually in existence now.
Yeah. And it will, I mean, I don't think this will be talked about too much, apart from in areas where it will create jobs. But I think nuclear will be a huge element of the renewable energy strategy going forward.
Right. Well, that sort of leads us nicely into what it means for bidders. And I think this is probably the most interesting part for me. So do you want to kind of go through the technical bits?
Yeah, just a few bits and bobs. So we have a couple of official public procurement notices, which are lovely reads in our world, the PPNs. So we've got the one which, if you've been bidding over the last few years, you should know about PPN 0621, which is around requirements for commitments to net zero 2050, and in some cases having a carbon reduction plan as part of your bid. There are value thresholds, but even beyond the value thresholds in places you are asked for a carbon reduction plan. Now, central government do this, but I have seen councils and other organisations also ask for carbon reduction plans. If you're not sure about carbon reduction plans, there's a template on the government website. There are various organisations that can help you develop these. Again, we won't go into detail on that, but if you are interested as well, that formed part of our webinar with Net Zero International earlier in the year. There was also a PPN that came out earlier this year. This is an optional schedule that procurement teams can put in, and it can form part of the terms and conditions of the contract, which could commit suppliers to specific decarbonisation objectives. Now, these will either be objectives that are being mandated as part of the bid, or objectives that maybe you have suggested or promised as part of your bid. They will actually go into the contract, and you'll be held to that. We do have the Procurement Act, which was meant to be next month, but will be, I'm going to say it might be February. It's planned to be February next year, 2025. I did not see specific environmental elements to that, but there is time to update and change that. One of the reasons, or the official reasons, the Procurement Act is being put back is because I believe the new government wanted to change, I think it was the purpose statement of the Act. So whether the environment will be part of that, who knows. The other point is the new government's plans have not properly kicked in yet. We've had the summer. Now they've made a lot of plans. They've done a lot of talking. There's been King's Speech, some activity through Parliament, but we've got the autumn statement coming up. And the autumn statement will properly set out, I think, for the first time, the government's spending plans. Again, trying not to get too political, but you may have heard things around a black hole in the finances. So what will actually happen at that autumn statement, I think, is up for grabs. That is due to happen on the 30th of October, and I would suggest anyone with any interest in the public sector, whether bidding, public spending, I suggest you keep an eye on that.
And if I was sat there as a bidder, I'd probably be having my head in my hands at the moment with yet another requirement that bidders have got to comply with, and that probably costs money. So I think it's a difficult one, this, in that it's another ask of suppliers, but buyers probably want either the same price or a slightly cheaper price.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is just in terms of how you either manufacture products or deliver a service. I think this is really important, if this applies to you, that there's some early thinking on how you put that into practice without having to increase costs in a already competitive market in most sectors. So I think even though that's just a small point on the slide, it's a really important one strategically for a lot of businesses, because it does make life a bit more difficult. Even though you could argue it's ethically for all the right reasons, and you'd be crazy not to do all this stuff. But
well, it's at the end of the day, the government outsources a lot of its stuff. So to meet their own targets, they have to put that on the supply. It's the same over here. So,
yeah.
What it is.
Okay.
There's been a few interesting opportunities across the last few weeks. So there was a big the consultancy framework, I believe, is still live, or it's soon to end. The ESPO Consultancy Services Framework. This was a framework for consultancy services across the entire public sector, or it could be used by the entire public sector. Lot 8 had many environmentally related sublots in there, specifically Lot 8B, which was purely on environment and sustainability consultancy. It was very vague as to what that actually meant, but it was quite interesting to see that. There's also been a couple of decarbonisation bids that we've seen. There's one we've just put there around Derbyshire Support and Facility Services Limited. I think I've seen one for the NHS through SBS as well. And there's also a retrofit scheme. There's been a lot of bids around estate, around starting that decarbonisation process in estate, because I think a lot of government estate is old and inefficient, and it's looking at how that can be made better. I've seen things around smart buildings being one where the lights are automatically turned off, and air vents and all sorts of things. But this is just, we've seen these over the last few years as well, but I think this is only going to increase as we go along. It's the only way the government will be able to hit their targets is to do a lot of the outsourcing of the expertise.
And there's extras that we haven't put on here. There was one that stuck in my head particularly this week, which was EV infrastructure for a council. And I think the point here is whether you agree with a specific technology or not. And I have some very interesting debates with people who don't think electric cars are the way forward and that hydrogen is. But the point is, we're not there with hydrogen. So for businesses, there are massive opportunities at the moment to respond to. So do you put yourself in a position where you say, well, we're not going to bid for that because we don't think it's right? Or as a business, do you respond to the opportunities out there and adapt until, assuming that, other technologies come online in the future? I think as a business and for bidders, these are things that are really interesting to look at. And along with all the policy stuff we've talked about, to try and map out where your business sits and how it will survive. over the next sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Because I think to get to 2050, I mean, we're 25 years away, essentially. There's probably a lot of development before then. And then when you look at some of those early targets from Wales and Scotland, if you are bidding in those areas as well, then you've got to get upstream a lot faster. So I think this is the bit for me that's, the first sort of 40 minutes was kind of setting the scene, giving people information around what's potentially going to happen. For businesses, this is where the real sort of brain power needs to go in translating all that information into what it means for you as a business.
Yeah. Well, I think it's quite interesting. The map we had up earlier, just on this, is look at those plans. If you're an organisation in one of those areas that's even slightly related to any of those projects, whether that's supply chain, infrastructure, whatever it is, have a look at that. Start talking to the right people. Can you be part of the process?
Definitely. Okay. Should we move on to future implications then, Rob?
Yeah, so just a bit of a summary of some of the things we have already talked about in places. So if there are not increased opportunities for renewable energy projects, I don't know what's going on. These projects are going to have to go out to tender one way or another, whether it's whole or in part or related elements to it. So Great British Energy is a 100% publicly owned company. In my head, unless they do something odd, that means it should be following government procurement rules, because in theory, it's a public sector body. Now, there may be nuances as to how they set that up. I'll be interested to see, but it should be following government procurement rules, or it should at least have a procurement policy that mirrors central government. That means almost everything it's going to put out above a certain threshold, say 25 grand or whatever it is, that's going to have to go out to tender, whether that's a closed tender or an open tender, depending on what the threshold is. So if you're even slightly related to what we've been talking about today, keep a lookout. Again, talk to the right people. Whether it's supplies, maintenance, development, consultancy, or is there an opportunity as your organisation to be looking at things you can do to potentially be involved in all this potential investment in your creation? So I'd say after the autumn statement, after the official establishment of Great British Energy, I'll keep a strong eye out for all of that, and we'll keep track of that as well, and probably update people as we go along as we see things happen. So at the moment, as a bidder, sometimes you have to do a carbon reduction plan. I would recommend if you're at least a medium-sized organisation, I would look at getting a carbon reduction plan done anyway. Not just in terms of requirements on a bid, but the evidence you can generate through developing the carbon reduction plan can be really helpful when you're answering environmental questions on a bid. The proof points you can get from that percentages make it a lot better than vague promises of, oh, well, we cut out paper a couple of years ago, but we've got no idea what the actual impact was. Everyone knows about social value, 10% of public sector bids. Often the environment is an element of that 10%. So you're having to make various promises. Having a net zero commitment as an organisation is always very good. Having actual environmental governance in your organisation goes down well. We work with many companies that have green champions throughout the organisation, looking at how green initiatives can be implemented and measured as they go along. And we're not looking just at huge measures of, let's be 100% on using renewable energy. It's also smaller things like helping out with local community projects. Can you help cut down on emissions for a local community by helping them with, for example, a water wheel for a community building in Southwell? Another point is the local implications. We talked before around the Green Party becoming the main party in Bristol through the local council elections in May. It'll be interesting to see if the Green Party continue to do well. We have a Labour government at the moment. What often happens is the party in government does not do so well in local elections for various reasons. People want to put a protest vote in, or they're disillusioned, or they want to look elsewhere. It'll be interesting to see if, for example, people on the left look towards voting for the Green Party rather than Labour and other areas? Will we see the Green Party take over more councils? And then will we have more local implications for social value requirements as a result of that?
Okay. I think we probably ought to summarise, Rob, seeing as we're
almost dead on time. Renewables aren't going to go away unless the black hole is worse than expected and there really is no money for investing in all of this. The UK has targets it wants to hit. It has to hit. Renewables are going to stay. You know, the 2050 target, the 2030 decarbonisation strategy, Labour, in particular on the 2031, have, I think, pinned their colours to the mast on that, if that is the right phrase, of actually making that happen. So I think there will be things linked to that. As we said, there's potentially more opportunities for environmental consultancy and decarbonisation, but also suppliers and infrastructure as well. Keep a lookout for the autumn statement. I think that's the key on this as to what money will actually go into it. Once the money's known, then procurement should follow. Watch this space.
I think the bottom line for me is that highly likely there will be more opportunities. The key point for me is making sure your business is ready to respond in a way that's commercially viable for both sides.
I think getting that insight as well. I mean, if you have a route into the decision makers at the moment in this early phase, or taking part in conferences or expos, whatever that is, make sure you know what's going on. Get ahead of the game.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're just slightly over time today. If anybody wants any further information, feel free to contact myself or Rob. Email addresses are there. There's also a phone number if you want to give us a ring. Thank you for joining us as always. We will see you in a month's time on the next webinar. In the meantime, there will be the usual Wednesday morning Q&A and Bid Breakfast bios. Hopefully we'll see you on those, and have a great weekend.
Thanks all.